My name is John Laybourne. I'm a retired Toronto police officer, and the events I'm going to be talking about, it's hard to believe, occurred some 50 to 60 years ago. It was around 1958. I was transferred in from uniform into the Morality Bureau, which at that time operated out of the old police headquarters at 149 College Street. Toronto was a completely different place than it is today. Toronto in 1958 was still thought of as the city of Toronto. Then you had all the little towns, Mimico and New Toronto and Long Branch, all being put together into this metropolitan area. Toronto, and every place in Ontario, I guess, was governed by the Liquor License Act and the Liquor Control Act. The Liquor License Act for policemen was one of the most powerful things there were. You could stop anybody on the street and say, "Are you carrying liquor?" and search them. You could search any premise except a house, and it wasn't hard to get a liquor search warrant for any kind of liquor. All the drinking establishments were closed at midnight. Saturday nights, they were closed at 11:30. It was a totally different way of looking at things than it is now. Because I'd come from the suburbs into the downtown Toronto, and because my inspector and the sergeant felt that I wouldn't be known to anybody, I was assigned to work undercover for the first 6 months or so that I was with the Morality Bureau. The group of men that we were targeting were known as the Three Thieves. In addition to controlling all of the bookmaking activities along the lakeshore, they also had a gambling house on number 10 highway out in Toronto Township, which is now Mississauga. At that time it was mainly farmland, and once you got out past the western boundaries of Metro Toronto. Now when we're talking about bookmaking in Toronto in the 1950s and 60s, we're talking about a completely different milieu. There was no computers, there was no internet, no online gambling. The biggest form of gambling in Toronto at that time was the racetrack. There was no off-track betting. You either had to go to the racetrack or you didn't bet, or you bet through a bookie. And of course, when we talk about horse racing in Toronto, we have to talk about Woodbine. The old Woodbine racetrack on Queen Street at Woodbine Avenue, and the new Woodbine out by number 27 highway. That was the only venue. In the winter time, when the racetrack closed down, the betting would shift to the United States tracks, the Kentucky Derby, down into Florida, Santa Anita, name it. The big sports betting was on baseball. All odds on sports betting in baseball were set on who was the pitcher. The bookies felt that all baseball teams were relatively equal, but whoever was pitching that day made the difference, and the odds on that particular day was who was pitching for the Red Sox or who was pitching for the Yankees. Football wasn't as big as it is now, but people did phone up on Sunday afternoon and place their bets. Hockey, bets were made, but they were relatively small. Baseball and horse racing were the two big things. And you could practically go into any beverage room, any beer parlor, and if you were known or if you made yourself known, you could find a local bookmaker. The way to find out who they were was simply to walk into a beverage room with a copy of the Globe and Mail open to the racing section and strike up a conversation, and within a few minutes it was quite obvious who was taking bets in that particular place. Two things. There was the front end, which was the guy who took the bets, and there was the back end, which was where the bookkeeping was done, where the actual written records were kept. A big thing the bookmakers hated was to have an arrest made and to have their payoff sheet with their record of who they owed money to seized by the police. If this happened, of course, all the bettors were winners and the bookmaker lost. Also, from time to time, the bookmakers had to take large bets, and if you didn't have the capital or the wherewithal behind you, you had to lay off the bets, which meant in effect, if I was a small-time bookmaker and I was afraid I was going to lose a lot of money, I would make a bet or lay off part of my bets with a larger group of bookmakers. And the King Edward Hotel, the telephones in the lobby were used for this purpose. And Toronto was actually one of the premier layoff centers in North America. And we found that in addition to people taking bets in the local beverage rooms, there was also a number of social clubs around Toronto that had morphed from being a social organization into a front for bookmaking. Trying to get rid of these charters was a real chore. It was trying to get the province who granted the charters to revoke them was almost impossible. The only way we would ever get anything on the social clubs was to get their back end, their recording sessions. And there was nobody to tell us how to do it. Nobody knew if wiretapping was against the law. We were amateurs. I mean, really amateurs. We were strictly venturing into a new era. There had to be a way of getting the number that they were calling, the phone number. So we acquired, and I can't recall how we did it, we must have had a friendly Bell telephone repairman, and we got a handset that the repairman used, which could be clipped into wires or a terminal. So what we would do is, when we found out that we could record telephone calls through a piece of wire and our induction coil and our handset, and of course a tape recorder. And you must remember too, in 1950s, tape recorders were not cassettes, they were reels of tape. And sure enough, right away there would be a telephone call recording a bet. And there we had another problem, was how to determine what the telephone number was. And we learned by trial and error how to slow down the tape recorder so that we could count the number of clicks made. There were no push button phones, it was all dial phones. And if you slowed it down, you could make out a telephone number would be click, 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 that would be 3, and then we would count them up until we had the number of we wanted, and then we would plan our next move, which meant going to where the phone was located, usually with a sledgehammer, force our way in, and hopefully before they could burn anything, we would grab the records. And when I say burn things, a lot of the records were kept on what we called flash paper. It was a chemically treated paper that if you just touched a cigarette butt to, or a lighted cigarette or a match to it, would, in a puff, be gone. No residue, no ash, completely gone. So the thing was secrecy to get to the place that we wanted to get in and grab the records. So this was around, I guess, around 1960 sometime. And out of the back room came a bunch of guys. One of them, dark-skinned, dark-haired guy, and I remember him. He had a black suit on, white shirt, and a white-on-white tie, if you can imagine. We got his name, and it was Johnny Papalia from Hamilton. So we got a hold of our friends in Hamilton, and they told us that this was one of the big shots in the local Mafia organization. The Hamilton Mafia was simply a branch of the New York State Magadino family. It was sort of like a hub. The Magadino, I guess, had connections in a lot of upper New York State and into Hamilton and eventually into Toronto. And again, well, Mafia, what did that mean? In those days, the FBI, Hoover, denied that the Mafia was a real organization. So we didn't really know anything, or not very much, about the Mafia, or about organized crime, actually. I got a phone call in the evening from a woman who asked if I was Mr. Laybourne. Now, another thing is that if you met anybody who was associated with criminals, what we called a rounder, if they called you Mr. Laybourne, it was sort of a code that they knew you were in the police department, and I would know, or anybody would know, that they were a rounder or in the mob or something. She went on to say that she was the wife of Mike Rush. Meyer Rush, nicknamed Mike, was a well-known Toronto hoodlum, and she was afraid of something was going to happen to her through some argument I guess she had with Mike, and she wanted to talk to us and do something. And I arranged to meet her in the exhibition grounds near what was the fountain, which was one of the centerpieces of the exhibition grounds. We started talking, and we said, well, what do you want to do? Well, she wanted to do something that would put Mike in jail. Okay, what was that? Well, she said, I have here, I took from Mike, a set of keys. And she produced this large ring with a whole bunch of keys on it. And she said, these keys will open any hotel room in Toronto. Right, yeah, right. No, she was quite serious. These were the keys that Mike used when he was what we called then, and I guess I don't know if they still do, a hotel prowler. Guys would walk up and down the corridor of a hotel and try the doors to see if they were open, or just steal anything they could. And over the next days, we found out that, in fact, these keys would open doors at most of the downtown hotels in Toronto. The Royal York, the Lord Simcoe, the King Edward, on and on. Wow. So then through that and through some other investigations, we were able, I don't think we made the actual arrest, but arrested Mike Rush on housebreaking charges. We were called into a meeting by our inspector, the guy in charge, who was into his office, and he was there, and some other officers from the RCMP. In the 1950s and 60s, we really didn't do much for drugs. I mean, the regular morality office. The drugs enforcement was handled by the RCMP. So anyway, these Mounties were from the local drug squad. And it was explained to us that Mike Rush wanted to make a deal. His wife had made a deal with us. Mike wanted now to make a deal with the RCMP that he would, in addition, if we dropped the charges against him, he would give them information, really big time information. We didn't know too much about it, but we agreed to go along with what they proposed. The charges against Rush were dropped, and we eventually learned that the information that Rush had given to M resulted in a huge quantity of heroin being seized in New York State. It resulted in a number of arrests being made, and lo and behold, one of the arrests was John Papalia, Johnny Pops, and he served time because of that arrest in Lewisburg prison. Sometime later, just as an aside or a continuation of the story, Meyer Rush, and this is in a big-time newspaper story, was the victim of a bombing at another downtown hotel in Toronto. Fortunately or unfortunately, the bomb was placed under Meyer's bed, and when it went off, the mattress of the bed muffled some of the explosion, and although he was badly injured, he was not killed. Probably this was the result of somebody finding out that he had ratted on Imperial.